Thank you, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking some time. I know we're getting towards the end of the term and everyone is getting slightly busier, but I think we really have to take the time tonight to welcome a new faculty member to the school, so Jane Hutton. She's joining us after, I guess, a unique process, but with the happiest results. And she's coming. She was just recently teaching at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in the Department of Landscape Architecture. So Jane Hutton, as I mentioned in the email that I sent to announce the lecture, she holds Bachelor's of Science in Biology and Environmental Science. No, not science, but yeah. From McGill University. And then she went on to study landscape architecture at the University of Toronto, the Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design. And she has taught for a while at the University of Toronto, and then, as I said, at the Department of Landscape Architecture at Harvard's GST. And she seems to have just created... Sorry, I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable situation, but she came with the highest recommendations from every place where she has been. Everyone just had wonderful things to say about her. So we're really fortunate that she's joining us. So tonight she's going to be talking about some of her research. She is interested in material ecology. She's interested in public materiality. She's interested in urban change. In political dimensions of what happens when we look at landscape. So looking at the movement or the not meaning, but the sort of underlying histories of the landscape that we are surrounded by, but through materials, movement of materials and labors. So short introduction. Everyone was very, very supportive here from the faculty members, and I think I'm really looking forward to working with you. And thank you for joining us. So welcome.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks to everybody for coming. And I'll hopefully express this over the coming months, but I'm just absolutely thrilled to be joining the school. It's a kind of community of scholars and teachers and students that I absolutely admire, and I can't wait to see how the kind of work that I've been doing is kind of augmented, but also like brought into conversation with the kinds of work that you are all doing. So today I'm going to talk about a range of projects that all kind of center on an interest in materiality, materials, and specifically kind of thinking about materials not solely as things that we specify to put into buildings or put into landscapes as a kind of static one state object, but thinking about materials as part of kind of much larger ecological flows, which incorporate human labor, non-human labor, climatic forces, and to try to think about design as kind of positioned within this broader network. So this image is the foreshore of the Thames in Greenwich. And it's a beach that's composed, that kind of like from far away looks like a normal beach, but when you look really close, you start to see that it has pretty much every single construction material in it that you can think of. And it's essentially, it's kind of like the debris of London, which has been turned over centuries, and you can see animal bones and sheep's knuckles and every kind of construction material. And in fact, the sheep knuckles were coming from the agricultural perimeter, but we're also construction materials. There's a place in London where there's a pavement made of sheep knuckles. So to me, this is an interesting image as a way to start to think about the fact that when we build things, they're always part of a much longer history, and that kind of understanding or probing those other dynamics, the broader histories of these materials is actually, or I speculate about how that can be generative and hopefully prompt different ways of building or different ways of thinking about construction and different ways of thinking about how we relate to other materials and other landscapes elsewhere. So just biographically, I studied biology at McGill, and I worked on a research project that looked at the the harvesting of palms in eastern Panama, and specifically in a community, in an indigenous community where palms were absolutely the basis for all material life. And at the time in the department, our lab was considered really bad science because it involved humans. And so for me, this was interesting. This was kind of my foray into landscape architecture, because I thought this is ecology. This is ecology, and humans are, obviously part of it. And so that was kind of an interest. How does the forest relate to construction materials at the time? How does that relate? How does that produce human habitation and human kind of cultural exchange? And then after I graduated from the landscape architecture program in the University of Toronto, I worked with Plant Architect, and again continued to be interested in where materials were coming from and what their kind of backstories were, but never really had enough time to get into that. So when I moved to the GSD, one of my jobs was to work in the materials collection, which was really super fun. And for me, one of the way that I started to see the collection was less a kind of exciting new shop for sexy new stuff, and more of an index of pretty much every relationship that humans have had with any landscape anywhere. So you've got forests, you've got quarries, you've got things made out of petroleum, and so to try to think about these, all of the kind of connections which usually are cleaved off because as designers we're specifying typically a product, and we are usually doing it pretty fast. And so my interest was to kind of probe this a little bit deeper and to think about materials in terms of how they impact. We select them for certain properties in situ that have incredibly significant effects, at a larger scale, like on a hot day in Atlanta. But they're also coming from, in our globalized kind of late capitalist world, they're coming from all over the world. And we're used to seeing, these maps of arrows that are kind of abstract, but also the points of these locations are very specific landscapes that have very specific kind of ecological and social conditions. And also, it's interesting to note the way that material consumption is very tightly coupled with political and economic events. So here you can see the spike in construction material consumption during the oil crisis and a recent recession, and the end of the recession of the 80s. And so, as we know, the construction industry has a whole slew of indices and kind of ways of starting to talk about these larger footprints or larger connections, and I think these are absolutely essential, and they're continuing to become more and more sophisticated and user-friendly. But my research is really about trying to think about what these types of indices cannot really touch, or not really unpack. And so for me, I'm drawing from Robert Smithson's non-sites as a kind of methodological example. So in this project, or in the set of projects, he was gathering material from quarries and other sites, and then kind of combining and configuring them within a gallery, which he called the non-site. And so these projects were about many things, but in some ways about the relationship between this kind of faraway, unknown extraction landscape and then the rarefied location of the gallery. And so for me, I kind of think of this as a metaphor for the landscape architecture project, or the kind of rarefied urban project, which all of my attention is usually on. But to think about its relationship to these other places and to try to bring that into the thinking of the design work. And so right now my primary research project is a book project, which I'm calling Reciprocal Landscapes, Cases in Material Movements. And each of these chapters is a pairing of two different landscapes. So the kind of organizational trope is that each chapter follows one material which ended up in New York City at some point over the last 150 years. In a kind of seminal landscape architecture project, a project that's been well-loved, well-documented, and each chapter follows a single material back to its origin and tries to draw up some kind of relationship between those two sites, which one is totally invisible, totally far away, totally unknown. But the intention of the project is to try to write about them, document them, and kind of bring them adjacent. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about some of these. The first one is about fertilizers. So I was here in the spring for the Representing Ambience conference, and I talked about this case. So I'm going to be extra brief on this one. But essentially, this is about guano, which is desiccated seabird excrement, which is used as a fertilizer and was used in a very trace amount in Central Park. So it was one of, it was used just a very little bit, but I think it's a significant material because it represents Frederick Law Olmsted's desire to be kind of on the cutting edge of agricultural, kind of modern agricultural specifications at the time. So, and this material was coming from the Chinchas Islands off the coast of Peru. So this chapter looks at the kind of formation of the idea of the pastoral landscape in an urban environment. It's kind of, health-giving, farm-giving benefits, but also at the same time the city is growing and agriculture is modernizing and industrializing, and agriculture starts to shift from organic fertilizers to more processed, mined, imported, stable fertilizers. And guano ends up being the kind of key player in that. So this is a cross-section of a guano island, which essentially is accumulated of heterogeneous materials into a kind of solid, packed material. But this chapter really looks at the way in which this incredibly, diverse ecosystem turns into a absolutely lucrative pile of resources overnight, and the role of incarcerated Chinese laborers in that industry, and kind of traces the relationship between landscape architecture and agriculture over time. So the idea that the landscape architecture project, in this case Central Park, is often mimicking another landscape elsewhere. Here it's kind of a picture of a farm, and it's doing things that the farm does. And even today, the picture of a farm here is incorporating the kinds of agricultural synthetic agricultural fertilizers that are pervasive and are the basis of our food industry today. The second chapter looks at granite paving blocks, which came from Vinyl Haven, Maine. And it focuses on the idea of circulation. So I'm interested in the fact that it's very kind of, there's a lot of discussion about material flows. And for me, these discussions tend to be very kind of abstract and kind of nameless vectors. And so I was interested in looking at a case where the material flow was very clearly flowed by a set of human hands, which they all are in general, but this is a case that kind of highlights that. So it looks at Broadway and the way in which in the late 19th century trade circulation was being hampered by actually kind of broken streets. And you can see the bleeding horse hoof there. So the kind of disruption of the flow of capital and goods, and the desire by the city to really kind of repave the city with granite, which was the kind of best known material at the time. And a lot of that granite was coming from New England, and a lot of it was coming from a particular archipelago in Maine, which was incredibly facile at shipping granite pavers down south to all of the urbanizing centers along the Atlantic coast. And so the chapter looks at how Vinyl Haven workers and workers in the area kind of initiated the first granite cutters union in response to egregious working conditions, in light of the incredible wealth that the quarry owners were getting because of these urban contracts. So essentially all grand federal buildings, all major street repavements, all new memorials, and kind of things of consequences, things of symbolic might were being constructed out of granite. And so essentially in 1892, there's the Great Paving Strike of 1892, where Maine workers essentially are locked out and entreat paving layers in New York City and eventually like throughout the Northeast to put down any granite that they had cut. And so the outfall of this is on a normal day when there's street work, it's a nightmare. But when you have tons of street work everywhere and all of the paving layers walk off the streets, essentially there was, just blocks and blocks and blocks of traffic disruption for the good part of a summer. And so this chapter really looks at the kind of disruption of flow, the human role in material flow and the disruption of flow. The third chapter is about structural steel that was used to cover over the train tracks in Riverside Park in the late 1930s, and looks at the Carey furnaces in Pittsburgh as a site of production of iron. So the desire was to kind of renovate the park and create a seamless leisure landscape. So this chapter is really about the conflict between industrial activity and then the leisure that's desired. Like once the profits have been gained from industry, the leisure that's desired, and then the conflict between the smoke and the pollution and the garbage and the industrial activities, and then in this case, the increasingly wealthy landholders in the neighborhood who kind of fought to remediate and kind of control the pollution. And then I contrast that with the same kind of condition that's happening in Pittsburgh, but let's say 40 or 50 years later, as the industry has started to leave, and a whole slew of kind of riverfront sites are starting to be turned into different, primarily retail environments. And I'm looking at Carey furnaces, which is an interesting case. So Carey furnaces has not been redeveloped, and partly because of the community and other kinds of reluctances about a purely retail redevelopment process. Carey furnaces is still its future is still unknown, and there is a lot of interest in kind of incorporating more employment opportunities, more kind of ecological dimensions, and more of the kind of existing community activities in it. So I think it's an interesting case in contrast to some of the earlier redevelopments. So essentially looking at waterfront redevelopments and the ways in which designers kind of remediate, and the conditions, the kind of, I guess, the activity of cleaning up for good and for questionable. The fourth chapter is about London plane trees that were planted. I'm looking at the specific set of them which were planted in Harlem in the 1950s and 1960s, and I'm looking at trees which came from a New York City Parks Department tree farm on Rikers Island. And so at this point in time, there's a kind of major disaster with the tree canopy. There's a lot of kind of disinvestment in the downtown, a lot of kind of repercussions of white flight and disinvestment in kind of infrastructure, but including trees. And so there's a political movement to try to lure the poor exiles in the suburbs back to town, where we're sure that their hearts are still long to be. So there's an idea that the tree canopy has a kind of restorative or remediative aspect, and that this could start to rebalance some of the perceived fears of the downtown. So at the time, Robert Moses proposes a tree nursery on Rikers Island, which at that moment is being converted from a landfill into a prison complex, with the idea that the prisoners would be actually cultivating and caring for the trees. And what I find interesting about the whole discussion at this time is that there's this idea that because these trees are being tended on the city's landfill, on the city's waste, and they're being tended by the prisoners, and also that there has been a kind of idea that trees can't live in the city. They're not living. They're all hazards. There's some idea that this is like New York City's terroir. It's like, actually, if the trees can grow here, they're going to survive. It's like the toughest of tough conditions. And that this nursery will provide a kind of unlimited cycle of trees for the city. And so quite a large tree nursery is constructed. and hundreds of thousands of immature trees are planted throughout the city, and a lot of, about 70% of those are London plane trees. And so in this case, this is the chapter really looks at the kind of idea of cycling. The Rikers Island is very close to Manhattan, obviously, and so the kind of continuous cycling of incarcerated people and trees and kind of this idea of the island as kind of a very distant away place, a kind of hidden place, but yet extremely close. And something that I found interesting in the research was that there's almost no records of this nursery and very little discussion about it, although it probably all of the beautiful boulevards of London plane trees that are still there, especially in the Lower East Side, are likely to have come from this nursery. And then the last case in this project is about ipe, hardwood from northern Brazil, which was used in the High Line in the first phase of the High Line. And ipe has really grown in popularity over the last couple of decades. This is an ad from Landscape Farms from 1973, and you can see there this quote: "When you have a site furnishing job to do, think about Chipman and 1,000-year-old redwood, even if your benches only have to last 100 years." And so this was a short-sighted ad campaign, and it really was, because within about 10 years there were literally none left. And so what I'm finding is that there's kind of a move, because of the combination of the eradication of the old growth redwood, but also greater access to tropical lumber. Tropical lumber starts to kind of replace redwood as North America's favorite deck, like kind of luxury deck material, but also landscape architecture material, because it's incredibly hard, it's incredibly durable, it's incredibly rot resistant, and you can see it in all kinds of public landscapes everywhere. And so ipe in particular is a very slow-growing species, which its ecological habitat is very sparse. So, which means that the slow growth actually provides the physical qualities that are so desirable. So, when it grows fast, it doesn't, or if you harvest a young tree, it doesn't have the kind of strength and rot resistance. And so the kind of ecological consequences of this are that it stimulates, it's an incentivization to kind of intensify and progress the frontier of deforestation, and because it's worth so much that it kind of is a driver towards for people to kind of move further and further into the forest. And there's somewhat of a scientific and non-scientific debate about the possibility of FSC certified wood being actually sustainable. And so this organization, Rainforests of New York, initiated a major campaign kind of calling on the city of New York to address its kind of old growth lumber practices, and there was a major demonstration on the first phase of the High Line, and consequently the second phase of the High Line incorporated a reclaimed teak. So yeah, this chapter looks at kind of the relationship between kind of material property and their kind of growth habitat, the reasons why they are what they are. So that's kind of the core of my research at the moment. But I wanted to talk about a couple other projects which are kind of related to this line of thinking. And one of them is a studio that I just completed in the spring at the GSD with Kilmo and Daniel Ibanez, which was a landscape architecture and architecture joint studio. And it kind of spawned from some research that we started the year before with a colloquium called Wood Urbanism, where we were interested in, I suppose how this relates to the book project is that I'm really interested in how these questions of larger material cycles, or kind of what we usually think of as externalities, are really not external, or what if they weren't external? What if they were not considered kind of elsewhere, other place, but could be considered as intrinsic to the act of design? And so this project and studio was about how to how can we think through these larger cycles, and how can that actually impact the way that you physically build something, or the way that you specify certain materials. So this is riding on a contemporary or current resurgence in interest in wood, which is a wonderful material for reasons that everybody knows about. But I think what's important to highlight is that wood is not just a thing. Wood is thousands of different things, different species in very different conditions and very different growing habitats, and is the kind of home of many different people as well. And so while the discourse often talks about wood as if it's a thing, it's really not. It's not something you can kind of just order. And so we tried to think about the way that very specific habitat differences might influence the way you think about design, and also thinking about the fact that people live in forests, and that is an absolutely central part of building with wood, trying to bring that into the conversation as well. So we focused on a case site in central Chile, which is an incredibly heterogeneous landscape with all incredibly diverse set of forests, but it has been since even before the last century been a site of heavily subsidized plantation production, which is often called Chile's neoliberal forest miracle. And so we were interested in looking at these different landscapes, trying to treat them very differently. So we had groups of students looking at plantations and looking at laminates and CLT adhered panels, students looking at secondary growth mixed forests, and then looking at non-adhered panels, and then students looking at old growth mixed forests, looking at decay resistant lumber, but also in the old growth forest looking at things which were not lumber. So trying to think about the forest as more than just the product, the wood. So this is a project which looked at the woodshed. So if one were to start to build a certain density within the city, what is the kind of spread or extent of plantation that would need to kind of feed it, as a way to check the desired intensification of a specific city? Like, could this be done in wood? This is a project that looked at plantation harvesting as part of a kind of urban park, as a way to bring people closer into the process of the plantation. And this project looked at non-timber forest products in a kind of periphery of an old growth forest. So looking at ways in which small landholders and indigenous communities could start to, the fact that they're collecting non-timber forest products for a market could be formalized in such a way that they had prevalence over a specific area of land. So if that's wood, talking about stone too. So this is an exhibit that I curated several years ago at the GSD. It was called Erratics, A Genealogy of Rock Landscape. It also featured the work of Claude Cormier in Montreal. And this project was about thinking about how designers use specific materials, and looking specifically at rocks. So not stone that's kind of like turned into something else, but rocks for rock's sake. So when rocks are actually there because they're representing bedrock or an erratic boulder. So where the rock actually has the designer has a desire for it to be there, kind of representing rock. So this is something that I'm interested in general, which is the way, which I mentioned before, the way that design, and I think this is interestingly true in architecture as well, or I'm curious about how it's interestingly true in architecture, but in landscape architecture for sure, there's always some form of relationship between something that we're building and then some idea about a kind of non-human constructed landscape. So this project looked at designers who've used rocks for rock's sake, from the Tanner Fountain at Harvard to the artificial rocks on the MoMA Roof Garden by Ken Smith, to the bedrock or the Canadian Shield in Yorkville Park, and looked at the kind of relationship between the relationship between the geology and cultural inquiry. So also historically trying to to locate these projects and the materials that they're actually using within the geological time frame, but also looking at the kind of geological antecedents. So this is an image by Louis Agassiz, which is kind of a critical evidence of the used in the development of the theory of glacial, or the glacial theory. So erratic boulders were important kind of specks of rock that were distributed throughout the world, that allowed people to, or allowed geologists and naturalists to piece together their movements. So the fact that they'd moved, the fact that they'd ended up in some kind of foreign location is really important to them. So this project, I got really interested in the way that cultural, I guess, the intersection between cultural and scientific discourses, or how those are intersected, because I think that is something that we are all doing to some degree. I think design is absolutely a synthesis of cultural and scientific, or kind of ways of thinking about the world, ways of thinking about things that are not just us. So I started to be interested in this drawing, which is the toe line of the last glaciation. And then I started to map out rocks, erratic boulders, which were named. So this is a kind of non-scientific index of any boulder that I could find that had a specific name. So if it was called Rocking Stone or Danny's Stone, or like something that was actually a milestone, a landmark. And realized that not only were these boulders really important for geologists to kind of piece together an understanding of how deep time worked, but also are really critical in different ways for kind of cultural, I guess, humans' understanding of deep time, humans' understanding of something kind of larger than themselves. And so this project started to kind of assemble different rocks that have different stories. So this is the Kidstone rocking stone. You can see there's a lever. You can rock it. This is the Rolling Stone in Fitchburg, which was lots of effort was exerted to try to keep it as one, which is ironic because, of course, it was never one thing. And then the Babson boulders in Massachusetts, a kind of moralizing project of Roger Babson to try to teach the people some stuff during the 1920s and 30s, and then Plymouth rocks. So I think another example of the ways in which these rocks were used to not only to kind of like grapple with an understanding of something bigger than ourselves, but also as a way to kind of rewrite history. So the supposed founding of United States in Plymouth Rock. But then also interesting to note the way that has been detourned through the National Day of Mourning, a kind of protest of the mythology of Plymouth Rock. And this is a kind of annual demonstration that occurs. So it's perhaps a little bit of a link, but to me this actually relates to design. If one is to think about design as kind of the cultural reformulation of physical stuff, I guess that's how I see it, and that I'm interested in the way we constantly kind of rethink our relationship to the world, both in time and in space. And so there's two kind of editorial projects I wanted to touch on. Scapegoat Journal. Hope you all know about Scapegoat Journal. You have Adrian Blackwell and Christy Pearson, our editors here, and this is a project we started about 8 years ago, and it's in your library, and it's also available online. So this project was really initiated through a set of kind of friends and colleagues in Toronto everyone was kind of teaching or practicing, but we had a lot of discussions about trying to grapple with the relationship between our design work and then political economy, and trying to think about the intersections between those. And so we initiated this journal, It's kind of organized non-hierarchically, and we solicit texts from different scholars and activists and artists. And it's been kind of set on a series of different themes, which we think are kind of fundamental to design itself. So starting with property, then service, the materialism. And I have been involved in 3 of them in particular. The second issue, which was on service. And in this case, looking at service both in terms of design and architecture, landscape architecture, as a kind of service provision. But thinking about social services, thinking about kind of volunteerism, and kind of the charitable architecture, and also thinking about labor. So there's some text in here about construction, self-management in Brazil. That sort of this range of topics. Materialism came next, and this issue looks at kind of materialist perspectives in design. And one, for example, this article here is a conversation by Jane Bennett, who wrote Vibrant Matter, with Alex Livingston, and we asked them if they could, Jane Bennett's work on kind of new materialism and thinking about the vitality of things. We asked her and Alex if they could walk around Baltimore and kind of contrast that philosophy with the incredibly entrenched and very, very visceral kind of systemic racial and economic injustice of the place. So these are the kinds of issues that are trying to be raised by that particular issue. And then more recently, this issue on Mexico City and Nafta. So this issue came out on the 20th anniversary of Nafta, and all of the texts look at the ways in which Nafta is somehow inscribed in the city, in Mexico City and its environs. So that is in building fabric, in social relations, and also even in soil. So looking at the specific types of corn that are being grown, and how Nafta has kind of reformulated soil biology even. And then finally, I wanted to end with this Landscript, which is a journal that is published through the ETH in Zurich, and I'm guest editing an issue which is coming out in the coming year called Material Culture. And for me, this is a chance to think about how material perspectives might allow, or basically, there are a lot of scholars who have material kind of lenses on their research, and looking at the ways in which that particular approach brings forward an understanding, or a kind of brings labor and kind of the backstory of construction to the forefront. And so the issue really asks questions about how are landscapes made. Jana Cephas is looking at race and the construction of roads in Georgia. Nancy Takahashi is looking at the academical village at the University of Virginia and the mountain behind it. So realizing that this kind of absolutely significant architectural idea was sourced by the landscape behind, which nobody really knows about. So the stone and water, but it also becomes a kind of depository for nuclear waste and dead bodies. So there's a really interesting relationship between these two places. So this text really maps closely onto my interests about these reciprocal places. And then Jenny Foster is looking at the Leslie Street Spit and the ways in which, like, the kind of ongoing material production, construction, and demolition of Toronto has been reformulated in the Spit. So I think these texts and these provocations of these authors are things that I really think are where my interests are right now, and I think I'm excited, and especially excited to see how working with you all is gonna help shape that, and hopefully some of this work resonates with your own, and we can have discussions about that and move this forward individually and collectively. So thanks so much.